Okay, let's get into this. I want you to just for a second picture a specific date. It is Friday, January 23rd, 2026.
Mm-hmm.
And for, most of us, it's just another Friday. You might be on your commute, maybe grabbing a coffee, just trying to get through the last day of the work week.
Right, just another day.
But for one young woman in the Philippines, this specific date has this incredibly heavy, really layered meaning. It's her birthday. She is turning 27 years old.
And she's not celebrating it? Not in any way we would recognize.
Oh, absolutely not. There's no cake, there are no candles, no party with her friends. She's not opening any gifts. She is waking up inside a detention facility in Tacloban City.
And as tragic as that is, spending a birthday in a cell, that's not even the real headline here. The headline, the real gut punch, comes from what happened just the day before.
Thursday, January 22nd.
Exactly. Because that was the day Frenchie Mecumpio received her gift from the judicial system. After spending nearly 6 years, think about that, almost 6 years in pretrial detention.
Which is a lifetime for someone in their 20s.
It's an entire chapter of her life gone. And on that day, she was finally convicted.
And this wasn't just any conviction. We're not talking about a minor charge or, a slap on the wrist.
No, far from it. The court found her guilty of terrorism financing. And the sentence was a prison term of 12 to 18 years.
12 to 18 years.
And to really grasp why this matters, why we're dedicating a full deep dive to this case today, you have to understand the precedent this sets. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, Frenchie Mecumpio is the first journalist.
Not just in the Philippines.
In the world.
Yeah.
The first journalist in the entire world to be convicted specifically of financing terrorism.
That is just a staggering statistic. The very first. It feels like a line has been crossed.
It's a watershed moment and a terrifying one.
So, okay, the mission for our deep dive today is pretty clear. We have to unpack how we got to this point. Because looking at this mountain of sources we have in front of us, court documents, detailed reports from the National Union of People's Lawyers, UN statements, this feels like it's about so much more than one woman in Tacloban City.
Exactly. Her story, Cumpio's story, is the focal point. It's the human face of this larger tragedy. But if we pull the lens back, what we're really looking at is a much broader systemic machine.
A machine.
We're calling it the playbook of repression. It's this complex mechanism that involves the weaponization of international financial standards, a really dangerous practice called red tagging, and on top of all that, systematic reprisals against anyone who even tries to cooperate with the United Nations.
Honestly, it sounds like the plot of a legal thriller. You've got everything, planted grenades, mysterious money, international banking watch lists, and witnesses who might just be testifying for a paycheck.
It has all those elements, you're right. Espionage, betrayal, incredibly high stakes. But the consequences aren't fiction. They are very, very real human rights violations.
So, where do we start?
We're going to start by walking through the case of Frenchie Mecumpio, just to ground all of this in a real person's story. Then we really need to dismantle this mechanism of red tagging and show you how it works. And maybe most surprisingly, we're going to explore how global rules that were designed to stop terrorists from moving money are actually being used to starve NGOs and journalists of the funds they need to even exist.
Okay, so let's start with Frenchie. Before all of this, before she was a name in a court document, who was she to her community?
Frenchie Mecumpio was, at her core, a community journalist. She was the executive director of a small outlet called Eastern Vista, and she was also a radio anchor for Axion Radio Tacloban.
So she was a local voice.
A very prominent one. She was young, she was vibrant, and she was focused on a very specific and very dangerous beat. She covered the stories that often get ignored by the big media outlets in Manila.
Which
specifically, alleged abuses by the military and the police in the Eastern Visayas region of the Philippines.
And I'm guessing that didn't make her a lot of friends in high places.
It put a target on her back.
Mm.
I mean, this is a region with a long history of conflict, and reporting on what's happening there on the ground requires a certain kind of bravery.
And she knew she was being watched.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
Long before her arrest, she had publicly reported being tailed by masked men on motorcycles. There was even an incident where someone came to her office holding up her picture and asking her colleagues where she was.
That's chilling.
She was documenting human rights abuses. And in the process of doing that, she became a subject of surveillance herself. And this all culminated in the early hours of February 7th, 2020.
The day of the raid.
Yes. She was arrested along with 4 other human rights activists. They became known as the Tacloban 5. And one of them was Mariel Domaquil, a church worker who was staying with her.
Let's talk about the raid itself, because the details from the court testimony they're pretty wild. This happened in the middle of the night, right?
2 in the morning. And that's a detail that really sticks with me.
Yeah.
Cumpio and Domaquil were asleep. They were in their sleeping clothes. It was a pre-dawn raid designed for shock.
And what's her account of what happened?
So according to Cumpio's testimony, there was a very suspicious sequence of events. First, an entry team of police officers bursts in. They secure the area.
Okay.
Cumpio says they frisked them, they checked the entire room, and they declared it clear. The room was clear. They then moved the 2 women out of the bedroom and into the kitchen area.
So to be clear, the room has been swept by a professional police team and found to be empty of contraband.
That's what she testified. Exactly. Then about 15 to 20 minutes go by, and a second team, a different group of officers called the search team, brings them back into the bedroom. And suddenly, lo and behold, there's a firearm and a grenade on the bed.
Wait, just on the bed?
On the bed.
Yeah.
And even more specifically, Cumpio testified that the grenade was found under her pillow.
A grenade under her pillow? I mean, I'm not a demolitions expert, but sleeping with a live grenade under your head seems, let's just say, highly unlikely.
It strains credulity, to put it mildly.
Especially if you already know you're under surveillance, you'd think that's the last thing you'd do.
And that's the detail that makes the defense's argument so compelling for so many people. The defense and international observers like the UN Special Rapporteur Irene Khan have all but said outright that this evidence was planted.
It's just too convenient.
The idea that a journalist who knows she's being tailed would sleep with a grenade under her pillow in a house she shares with a church worker, it's absurd. And that absurdity is what led to the famous headline that came to define the case. A grenade under her pillow. It became a symbol.
A symbol of how flimsy the charges seemed, and yet the verdict was split. This is where it gets really confusing.
This is the judicial contradiction at the heart of the case, because the court acquitted Cumpio and Domaquil on the charges of illegal possession of firearms and explosives.
So the judge looked at the grenade under the pillow story and basically said, I don't buy it.
It seems that way, yes. The judge essentially said there wasn't enough credible evidence to prove they owned those specific guns and that grenade. Maybe implicitly acknowledging the planted evidence theory.
Okay, so she's acquitted, she's going home.
You'd think so. But in the very same breath, the very same verdict, the court found them guilty of terrorism financing.
So we don't believe you had the grenade, but we do believe you were funding the people who use grenades. That feels like a massive disconnect.
It's a huge disconnect.
What was the basis for that financing charge then, if not the weapons found in the raid?
Well, the police also claimed that during that same raid, they found a significant amount of cash. And the prosecution built a narrative around that cash. They alleged, and you have to pay attention to the timeline here, that Cumpio and Domaquil were involved in a plot to give money and ammunition to the New People's Army, the NPA.
Okay, so they're linking the cash to the armed group.
Yes, but the terrorism financing charge itself wasn't even filed until more than a year after their arrest. They were already in jail.
It was added on later.
Much later. It feels like a retrofit. The prosecution's narrative was that they were planning to travel to a place called Catbalogan City to deliver about 100,000 pesos in ammunition. But this was all based on the testimony of a single witness, which we'll get to.
And what was the defense's explanation for the cash they found in the house?
It was very straightforward.
Yeah.
The money was for a campaign called Stand with Samar.
They stand with Samar.
Yes, it was a humanitarian relief drive. It was for farmers in the Samar region who had been hit hard by a series of typhoons and were also caught in the middle of increased militarization in their areas. Cumpio, as the executive director of the media outlet Eastern Vista, was the custodian of these donation funds.
So we have humanitarian aid money being relabeled by the prosecution as terrorist funds.
That is the core of it. And this is where the judicial contradictions just pile up. Because in October of 2025, so just a few months before this criminal conviction, the Court of Appeals, which is a higher court, actually ruled in Cumpio's favor in a separate but related civil case.
What was that case about?
The Anti-Money Laundering Council, or AMMLC, had frozen all of her bank accounts and assets based on these same allegations. And the Court of Appeals reversed that freeze. They not only reversed it, they reprimanded the AMLC. They used the phrase hasty labeling and said the agency had branded a journalist as a terrorist without proper due process.
Let me make sure I have this straight. A higher court looks at the financial evidence and says there's no basis to freeze her assets, stop labeling her a terrorist.
Correct.
And then just a few months later, a lower trial court looks at essentially the same set of allegations and says, you're guilty of terrorism financing, go to jail for up to 18 years.
That is the paradox. It's stunning. Where you have one part of the judiciary saying the evidence doesn't hold water, while another part uses it to hand down a massive prison sentence. It highlights what her lawyers at the National Union of People's Lawyers call the weaponization of the law. The charges just shift and morph until something, anything, sticks.
It really does feel like they thought, okay, the gun charge might fail because the grenade story is just too ridiculous. We need a backup plan. Let's throw the financing charge at them.
That's precisely the argument made by press freedom and human rights groups around the world. And it brings us directly to the core mechanism that makes all of this possible. We have to talk about red tagging.
Right. We hear this term a lot, especially in the context of the Philippines, red tagging. To an outsider, it might just sound like name calling, like calling someone a communist or a socialist. Oh, you're a lefty. But it's so much more dangerous than that, isn't it?
It is lethal. And that's not an exaggeration. The Supreme Court of the Philippines itself has acknowledged in a ruling that red tagging is a practice that threatens a person's life, liberty, and security.
So it's not just an insult.
It's not name calling, it's a signal. When the government, and specifically this body called the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, the NTF-ELCAC, when they label you a red, a communist, a terrorist, or a front for the NPA, it is essentially a declaration of open season on you.
It puts a bullseye on your back.
A literal one in many documented cases. It's a precursor to harassment, surveillance, arrest, and sometimes extrajudicial killing.
And this NTF-ELCAC, this isn't some small, obscure committee, is it?
No, it's a massive institutional machine. It was created under the former president, Duterte, but it's continued and, some would argue, been strengthened under the current president, Marcos Jr. It employs what they call a whole-of-nation approach.
What does that mean, whole of nation?
It means they mobilize every single government agency, from the military and police to social welfare, education, you name it, to focus on one goal: crushing the communist insurgency. But in practice, it completely blurs the line between an armed combatant, someone actually holding a gun in the jungle, and a civilian critic.
Like a journalist with a microphone.
Or a church worker with a bag of rice for farmers. Or a lawyer defending an activist. Anyone who questions the state's narrative can be labeled a part of the enemy's support system and therefore becomes a legitimate target.
And they do this very publicly. I've seen descriptions of the tactics they use, like giant tarpaulins hanging in town squares.
Yes. Imagine walking through your own community and seeing a massive poster, what they call a rogues gallery, with your face on it, right next to photos of armed rebels accusing you and your organization of being terrorist recruiters.
That's terrifying.
They do this to perfectly legal, above-board organizations. Groups like Bayan Muna or Gabriela, which is a women's rights group, or Kabatan for youth issues. These are legal political parties with elected members in Congress, yet the military puts up posters in public places claiming they're nothing but fronts for the NPA.
And once your face is on that poster, the journey from there to a prison cell seems pretty short.
It's the next logical step. And to get you from that poster to the prison cell, they need evidence. Or, more accurately, they need testimony. And this brings us to what's been called the professional witness industry.
A professional witness. Now, you don't mean an expert witness like a forensic scientist.
No, not at all. I mean someone who appears to make a career out of testifying against activists and critics of the state. The government's cases, like the one against Cumpio, often rely almost entirely on rebel returnees.
So people who claim to be former rebels who have surrendered.
That's the idea. They're presented as insiders who can expose the front organizations. But the problem, and it's a huge one, is the incentive structure.
They get something in return for their testimony.
They get a lot. They can get money, housing, livelihood assistance. But the most powerful incentive of all is immunity.
Right.
Think about it. If you're a former rebel facing decades, maybe life, in prison for your own actions, and the military comes to you and says, hey, all you have to do is testify that you saw Frenchie Cumpio at a meeting, or that she gave you money, and we'll drop all the charges against you and give you a monthly stipend.
That is an incredibly powerful motivator to say whatever they want you to say.
It's an incentive to commit perjury. It's a system that can manufacture evidence on demand.
And was there a specific example of this in Cumpio's case, a key witness?
Yes, a woman by the name of Alma Gabin. She was a star witness for the prosecution. The NUPL report on Cumpio's case highlights her as a prime example of this professional witness phenomenon. She claims to be a former high-ranking NPA recruiter. But here's the thing. She doesn't just testify against Frenchie Cumpio. Her name pops up in multiple, completely unrelated cases. She testifies against opposition candidates during elections. She testifies against disaster relief NGOs in other parts of the country. She testifies against church workers. She's everywhere.
So she's like the government's Swiss Army knife of witnesses. Whenever they need to connect an activist to the MPA, they wheel her out.
That's a good way to put it. And her testimony is often the only link. In Cumpio's case, the judge relied heavily on Gavin's testimony to establish that the humanitarian aid money was actually for the MPA, directly contradicting all the evidence the defense presented about the Stand With Samar campaign.
And when you have a witness whose livelihood and freedom are completely dependent on the very people prosecuting the case, their credibility should be under intense scrutiny.
It should be. But in these special anti-terror courts, their word is often treated as gospel truth.
So we have the red tagging, which creates the target. We have the dubious witnesses who provide the evidence. But there's a bigger, more invisible layer to all this. You mentioned weaponizing global finance. This is where the story leaves Tacloban City and goes all the way to, what, Paris? To the Financial Action Task Force.
This is the invisible war, and yes, it runs straight through Paris. The Philippines is currently on what's known as the FATF gray list.
FATF, let's break that down.
The Financial Action Task Force. It's the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. It sets the international standards. And being on their gray list is a big problem for a country.
Why is it a problem?
It means you're a jurisdiction under increased monitoring. It signals to the rest of the world that your systems for fighting financial crime are weak. This makes international banks wary. It can hurt foreign investment, increase the cost of doing business, and even make it harder and more expensive for Filipinos working abroad to send money home to their families.
So the government is under huge pressure to get off this list.
Desperate is the word. They've launched what they call Project Exit the Gray List. It's a top national priority. But here is the perverse twist.
Okay.
To prove to the FATF that they're serious about cracking down on terrorism financing, they need to show results. They need statistics. They need convictions. They need to show that they are freezing assets. So instead of going after the actual big-time money launderers, the corrupt politicians, the drug lords, the illegal online gambling operators,
You go after the low-hanging fruit.
they go after the easy targets, the NGOs, the journalists, the activists, people who don't have armies of high-priced lawyers.
It's a way to pad their stats for the international community.
It's exactly that. It's a phenomenon that policy experts call policy laundering. They take these legitimate international standards, which were created to stop groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and they use them as a cover, as a shield, to legitimize their own domestic repression. They can turn to Paris and say, look, FATF, we're doing our job. We convicted a terrorist financier. We froze the assets of a terrorist front.
But the terrorist financier is a 27-year-old journalist covering local news.
And the terrorist organization is a disaster relief center that just won an award from the UN.
This is wild. Let's break down the specific rules they're using to do this. The outline mentions FATF's Recommendation 8. What's that about?
Right, so Recommendation 8 is, on its face, a good thing. It's designed to protect nonprofit organizations, or NPOs, from being abused by terrorists. The idea is to say, hey, governments, make sure bad actors aren't using a charity as a front to move money for attacks.
That makes sense.
But the way it's applied, or rather misapplied in the Philippines, is the problem. They use it to justify massive, sweeping overregulation of the entire nonprofit sector. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, issued these memorandum circulars that basically categorized almost all NGOs as inherently high risk for terrorism financing.
All of them. High risk.
A huge swath of them, yes, which then triggers these incredibly burdensome reporting requirements. They demand massive data dumps. They want lists of all your donors. They want lists of all your beneficiaries.
And if you're a human rights group, handing over a list of your beneficiaries to the government, it's a huge problem.
It's a massive breach of trust and safety. The people you are helping are often victims of abuse by that very same government.
Yeah.
Giving up their names puts them in danger.
It's a catch-22.
And it has a knock-on effect with the banks. Banks are, by nature, very risk-averse. They don't want to get hit with massive fines by the regulators for failing to comply with anti-money laundering rules. So when the government declares that NGOs are high risk,
The banks just want to wash their hands of the problem.
they just close their accounts. It's a practice called de-risking. It's easier for the bank to just shut down the accounts of legitimate, long-standing humanitarian organizations than to deal with the regulatory headache. And the effect is that it starves civil society of its lifeblood. It's a denial of access to financial resources, pure and simple.
And it's all done under the guise of complying with international standards.
Exactly. Then you have Recommendation 6. This one's even more direct. It's about targeted financial sanctions.
So this is the asset freeze?
This is the asset freeze mechanism. In the Philippines, this power is wielded by the Anti-Terrorism Council, the ATC. Now, the ATC is not a court. It's an executive body made up of cabinet officials appointed by the president.
So it's a political body, not a judicial one.
And they have the power to designate a person or a group as a terrorist. Just like that. There's no hearing. You're not in the room. You don't get to present a defense. They just publish your name on a list.
Once your name is on that list.
The AMLC, the Anti-Money Laundering Council, is legally required to freeze all your assets immediately. And they do it ex parte.
Ex parte. You said that before. That means without the other party there.
Exactly. No prior notice. One day your ATM card just stops working.
And this doesn't just affect the person who is designated, right? You said it's broader.
This is where it gets truly Kafkaesque. The law allows them to freeze not just your accounts, but any related accounts.
What qualifies as a related account?
The definition is incredibly broad and subject to abuse. All right. Let's look at the case of the Light Center for Development, the LCDE. This is not some shady, unknown group. This is an award-winning NGO. They were internationally praised as heroes for their work. After Super Typhoon Yolanda devastated the region, they won awards from the United Nations.
So by any objective measure, these are the good guys.
Undeniably. But because they were red tagged by the military, the ATC designated them, and the AMLC froze their bank accounts. But they didn't stop there.
Okay.
They froze the personal bank account of the organization's executive director, a woman named Jasmine Jerusalem. Then they froze the bank account of her son, who had nothing to do with the NGO.
Her son?
Yes. But it gets even crazier.
Yeah.
They then froze the account of the local hardware store the NGO had bought supplies from to rebuild houses.
Yeah.
And they froze the account of the local grocery store where they bought rice for relief packages.
You're kidding. The hardware store, the corner grocery.
I am not. Because they had transacted with the designated entity, the government labeled their businesses as related accounts. Now imagine you own a small hardware store in a provincial town. You sell some plywood and nails to a local charity. And the next day, your entire business account is frozen. You can't pay your suppliers. You can't pay your employees.
It would destroy you. And it would send a message to every other business in town.
Do not do business with these people.
Yeah.
It creates a financial quarantine zone around them. No one will rent them an office. No one will sell them supplies. No one will even sell them a cup of coffee because they are financially radioactive.
It's a form of collective punishment. You're not just targeting the activists, you're targeting their entire community.
You're completely isolating them. And this brings us to the next step in the playbook, which is how they criminalize the very act of helping someone. This is what we're calling the criminalization of humanitarian aid.
This is the story about the 500 peso bill, isn't it? When I read this in the source material, this one really just, it blew my mind.
It's the case of Fritz Labiano and Adrian Paul Tagle. These are two young human rights workers. They did something very basic, very human. They went to a jail to visit political prisoners.
A standard paralegal or humanitarian visit.
Exactly. It's a fundamental act of compassion. They brought the prisoners some food, and they brought a small amount of cash so the prisoners could buy essentials from the jail's commissary, like soap or extra food. It was 500 Philippine pesos.
And 500 pesos is what, in U.S. dollars?
At the time, it was about $9, maybe $10.
$9.
For providing food and $9 to detain prisoners, Fritz and Adrian were indicted for terrorism financing.
That is just, it's insane.
The prosecution's argument was that giving food and $9 to a detained person who has been accused of terrorism constitutes material support to terrorism.
If giving a prisoner a sandwich and soap is now legally defined as financing terrorism, then the definition has lost all meaning. It's been stretched to the point of absurdity.
And that is the point. The law is deliberately vague on the question of intent. The material support clause becomes a trap. It's designed to criminalize compassion.
And it has a clear chilling effect.
A massive one. It discourages anyone, paralegals, family members, friends, pastors, from helping anyone who has been detained for political reasons. Because if you help them, you could be next. You could become a terrorist financier too. It enforces total isolation on the detainee. It's a denial of access to human contact to the outside world.
And we see this same principle applied not just to individuals, but to entire communities. The case of the UCCP Haran Sanctuary.
Right. The UCCP Haran is a church compound, part of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, in Davao City. For years, it served as a sanctuary, a safe haven for thousands of Lumad people.
The Lumad are the indigenous peoples of Mindanao.
Yes, and they were fleeing intense militarization, bombing, and displacement from their ancestral lands. The church opened its doors to them, but the government red-tagged the church and the Lumad leaders, and then they used the anti-terror law.
They froze their assets.
They froze the church's bank accounts. They froze the money the church was using to pay its water bill and its electricity bill for the sanctuary.
So they literally tried to cut off the lights and the water to a refugee sanctuary.
They did. And eventually, the pressure became so immense that they were forced to close the sanctuary. The Lumad families, the refugees, were displaced all over again.
That's the real-world cost of these financial games. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet in some government office. It's indigenous families losing the only safe place they have.
It's disaster victims in the Cordillera region not getting relief goods because the bank account of the local NGO, Cordis RDS, is frozen right when a typhoon hits. It's what human rights groups call financial warfare, and it's being waged against the most vulnerable communities.
It's just devastating. And it seems that if you try to complain about this, if you try to tell the rest of the world, hey, this is happening in my country, you get punished for that too.
That is the final, and perhaps most insidious, layer of this trap. Reprisals. When you try to cooperate with international bodies like the United Nations, you become a target again.
This isn't just a Philippines problem either.
No, this is a global playbook. The UN Secretary General releases a report every single year dedicated to this specific issue. Reprisals against individuals and groups for cooperating with the UN. The Philippines is a regular feature in that report, but sadly, it's a long list. It includes countries like China, Egypt, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Israel. It's a global trend.
What kind of things happen to people who try to speak to the UN? Give us some examples.
Travel bans are one of the most common and effective tactics. Take the case of Anexa Brendley Alfred Cunningham in Nicaragua. She's an indigenous rights expert. She flew to Geneva to participate in a UN session to speak about the rights of her people. When she tried to fly home,
They wouldn't let her back in.
the Nicaraguan government blocked her return. They denied her entry into her own country. She was effectively exiled, rendered stateless, for speaking at a UN meeting.
That's a complete denial of access to her own home.
And we see similar tactics used by Israel against Palestinian human rights defenders. The organization Adamir, which provides legal support to Palestinian prisoners, has been designated as a terrorist organization by the Israeli government, a very similar process to the red tagging we've been discussing.
And their staff face the consequences.
Their staff face travel bans. The general director, Sahar Francis, has been banned from entering the United States. Another one of their lawyers, Salah Hamouri, a French-Palestinian national, was stripped of his Jerusalem residency and deported to France.
And it gets even more violent than just travel bans and deportation.
Much more. In Egypt, the case of Ibrahim Metwali is just heartbreaking. He's a lawyer whose own son was forcibly disappeared. He co-founded an association for families of the disappeared.
So he's fighting for others going through what he went through.
Yes. And he was on his way to the airport in Cairo, ticket in hand, to fly to Geneva to meet with the UN Working Group on enforced disappearances. He was arrested right there at the airport.
Before he could even get on the plane.
He was taken to the infamous Scorpion Prison, a maximum security facility known for torture. He was tortured, and he's been held in pretrial detention for years now, with the state constantly recycling charges against him to keep him locked up and silent.
The message is brutally clear. Don't you dare tell on us.
That is the message. And in the United Arab Emirates, there's the case of Ahmed Mansour, a very prominent human rights defender. He's being held in solitary confinement for years. He's been denied a mattress. He sleeps on the floor. He's denied proper medical care, his crime. He managed to get a letter published in the media in London detailing his mistreatment. The state retaliated with even more cruelty to silence him completely.
It's punishment for speaking out. And
Yeah.
you mentioned GONGOs earlier. That's a kind of fun-sounding acronym for something that sounds pretty sinister.
GONGO. Government-organized, non-governmental organization. It's a complete oxymoron, right? These are fake NGOs, shell groups created and funded by the state.
And what's their purpose?
Their purpose is to hijack the conversation at the UN. When the UN Human Rights Council holds a session, the government of a country under scrutiny will flood the room with its guenjos.
So they just drown out the voices of the real independent
They
activists.
drown them out, they intimidate them, and they parrot the government's official line. They'll take the microphone and say, human rights in our country are perfect. These other people you're hearing from are liars. They're terrorists. Don't listen to them.
It's a form of information warfare inside the halls of the UN.
It is. We see this with go-go's from China, from Israel, from the Philippines. It turns the UN forum from a place of dialogue into a theater of state-sponsored intimidation. Chinese don't-go's have even been documented physically photographing and harassing independent activists inside the UN buildings in Geneva. It's a physical obstruction of the process.
And what about the UN itself? Is the institution able to fix this? To push back?
It's struggling. A key part of the problem is the UN's own NGO committee. This is the body that decides which NGOs get accredited to participate in UN meetings. And it's often chaired by or has members from the very countries that are committing the abuses.
The foxes are guarding the hen house.
That's the critique, yes.
Yeah.
They use a bureaucratic tactic called deferral. An independent human rights group applies for accreditation, and a state on the committee will ask them an endless series of repetitive, pointless questions. And they just keep deferring the application meeting after meeting, year after year.
They just block them with paperwork.
Exactly. There's a prominent Dalit rights group, an organization fighting caste-based discrimination in India, that was blocked by this committee for 15 years.
15 years just to get a badge to walk in the door.
It's censorship by bureaucracy. It's a fundamental denial of access to the UN's own forums, executed with paperwork. And we see this in other UN bodies, too, like UN Women or ISCAP, where independent civil society groups from Taiwan are routinely blocked from attending meetings because of pressure from China over the One China policy. The door is just slammed in their face.
This paints an incredibly bleak and interconnected picture. We've gone all the way from Frenchy-made Cupio and a sell and tackle ban, to a frozen hardware store account, to torture in an Egyptian prison, to these bureaucratic walls in New York and Geneva. Let's try to connect all these dots as we wrap this up. What's the final big picture here?
The big picture is that the Cupio conviction is the tip of the iceberg. But it's also the proof of concept. It shows that the entire playbook of repression works.
Lay out that pattern one more time.
First, you red tag. You use state media and official task forces to label the target as a terrorist, to dehumanize them and justify what comes next. Second, you designate. Use a political body like the Anti-Terrorism Council to make it official without the hassle of a trial.
Then you cut off their money.
Third, you freeze. You use the anti-money laundering laws and the banks to cut off their financial lifeline and isolate them from their community. Fourth, you criminalize. You bring them to court on charges like terrorism financing, using planted evidence or state-sponsored professional witnesses.
And finally,
you silence. You put them in prison for 18 years, sending a chilling message to anyone else who might dare to speak up.
and the most perverse part of it all is that the government then turns around to the international community, to the FATF in Paris, and says, see, we're complying with global standards, we're fighting terror, now please take us off the gray list.
That's it. They use compliance as a shield to destroy civil society. It's a system where the international rules designed to keep us safe are being systematically weaponized to make us less free.
I just want to return to Frenchy Cumpio for a moment. There's a quote from her, something she wrote from prison, that's in our source material.
Yes, she wrote a reflection on her time in detention. It really captures the human cost of all this legal and financial maneuvering.
Can you read it?
She wrote, "This more than 5 years of detention is robbing us of so many things: time, family, dreams, plans, future. People call us brave for holding on, although I would have to admit I sometimes feel otherwise. The fact that they are capable of charging us through mere lies. Nonetheless, we hold on."
Nonetheless, we hold on. That's just incredibly powerful. And so tragic, especially when you remember that her family came to the courthouse on the day of her verdict with a bag of fresh clothes for her. They were so sure she'd be acquitted and was coming home.
And instead, they left with the bag of clothes, and she went back to a cell to face the next 12 to 18 years of her life.
So here's the final thought you want to leave with you, the listener. It's a question for you to really think about. We all live in a world that is, understandably, terrified of terrorism. We want our governments to keep us safe. We want them to stop the bad guys. But if the definition of terrorism financing has been expanded so wide that it now includes a journalist reporting on military abuse or a paralegal giving a prisoner a $9 commissary gift, what happens to the meaning of the word terrorism itself?
Doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
And if we allow these security laws to be used to systematically destroy the very fabric of a free society, the independent journalism, the humanitarian aid, the right to dissent, what we call civic space, are we actually making our society safer? Or are we just destroying it in the name of protecting it?
Think about where your security laws come from and who the real target actually is. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Stay informed.
Welcome to the debate. Yesterday, January 22nd, 2026, the gavel came down in a sweltering courtroom in Tacloban City. Frenchie Mae Cumpio, a 26-year-old journalist who has spent nearly her entire 20s behind bars, was sentenced to up to 18 years in prison. She wasn't convicted of the firearms charge that justified the raid on her home 6 years ago. She was acquitted of that. Instead, she was convicted of financing terrorism.
And it's a verdict that has, well, it's set the human rights world on fire, but it also forces us to confront a pretty brutal reality of modern security. On one hand, you have the state's absolute duty to choke off funding for violent insurgencies. On the other, the terrifying possibility that the very laws designed to stop bomb makers are being used to dismantle the free press.
And that is exactly the question we are wrestling with today. Is the global architecture for counterterrorism financing, a system built by the UN and the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, is it functioning as intended? Or has it become, the ultimate tool for lawfare and state repression? I am the advocate.
And I am the dissenter.
I'm going to just put my cards on the table immediately. The conviction of Frenchie Mae Cumpio is not just a miscarriage of justice, it is a structural failure of international law. This is the first time in history a journalist has been convicted of terror financing. It is the culmination of a playbook of repression where the Philippines is manipulating global standards to silence local critics. This isn't about stopping money laundering. It's about red tagging, labeling journalists as communists to justify locking them away when you have no other evidence.
I understand the outrage. I really do. 18 years is a lifetime. But we have to be careful not to let emotion override the legal facts here. The state has an international obligation to stop money from reaching the New People's Army, or NPA. We are talking about an act of insurgency. So while the length of a pretrial detention, 6 years, is indefensible, we cannot simply dismiss the verdict of an independent court as a sham. If Cumpio is moving cash and ammunition to a designated terrorist group, that is a crime. It doesn't matter if she held a press pass.
If she was moving cash, and that right there is the operative word. Let's look at the timeline because it just exposes the whole sham. February 2020, a raid at 2 a.m. Police claim they find a pistol and a grenade. Frenchie Mae screams that the evidence was planted. And yesterday, the court. Well, the court essentially agreed with her. They acquitted her on the firearms charge because the evidence was insufficient. The terrorism financing charge, that wasn't even in the initial warrant. They tacked that on a full year later when they realized the gun charges might not stick.
Hold on, though. You are framing the acquittal on firearms as proof of a conspiracy, but I see it as proof of judicial independence. If this was some kangaroo court operating under orders to crush her, why acquit her of anything? Why not just find her guilty on all counts and throw away the key? The judge, Judge Georgina Perez, she looked at the evidence. She threw out the gun charge because of doubts about the raid, but she kept the financing charge because of witness testimony. That shows discernment, I think, not a conspiracy.
Or it shows they needed something to justify keeping her in prison for 6 years. I mean, you can't just release someone after 6 years of detention and say, oops. But here is a smoking gun that proves this verdict is legally incoherent. We need to talk about the money.
The 557,000 pesos seized in the raid?
Exactly. About 10,000 US dollars. Frenchie Mae and her co-accused, Mario Domaguel, testified that this was money for Stand for Samar, humanitarian relief for farmers. But it's not just their word. In October 2025, just 3 months ago, the Court of Appeals, a higher court, reversed the civil forfeiture of that exact same money.
Right, I read that decision.
Then you know how damning it is. The Court of Appeals reprimanded the Anti-Money Laundering Council, the AMLC. They said there was hasty labeling and I'm quoting, no evidence the funds were linked to terror. Now, think about the legal standard here. In a civil forfeiture case, the burden of proof is preponderance of evidence. It's easier for the state to win. In a criminal case, it's beyond reasonable doubt, much harder. So the state lost the easy case but somehow won the hard one. I mean, that is a legal impossibility unless the facts are being manipulated.
It looks like a contradiction, I grant you that. But legally, they are two different tracks. The civil forfeiture case was about the cash itself. Was the chain of custody correct? Was the seizure procedural? The criminal case is about the act. And the trial court didn't just look at the banknotes. They listened to rebel returnees, former insurgents, who testified under oath.
Rebel returnees. Let's call them what they often are, coerced witnesses.
Well, that's an assumption. The court found them credible, specifically a witness named Lex Mika Bastillo. He didn't just talk about money. He testified that he personally saw Campio and Domaquil delivering cash and ammunition to the NPA. The Court of Appeals looking at a bank seizure warrant. That doesn't negate an eyewitness account of lethal aid being delivered. If the judge believed the witness, the status of the specific bills in the forfeiture case becomes, secondary to the act of support.
But you are ignoring the context of how these witnesses are produced. The National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, the NTF-ELCAC, has a documented history of pressuring individuals to testify in exchange for amnesty or cash. And what about the secret murder charges?
The charges that were dismissed, you mean?
Yes, but look at the pattern. While she was in jail, they suddenly charge her with the double murder of soldiers from 2019. It turns out she was 7 hours away at a journalism seminar when the murder happened. It took years to get that dismissed. They threw firearms at her, acquitted. Murder, dismissed. Finally, they get her on financing using subjective witness testimony. This is lawfare. You just throw everything at the wall until something sticks, just so you can claim a conviction.
It's messy, yes, but the state would argue that they are finally connecting the dots. The NPA has survived for decades. How? They don't have a tax base. They rely on extortion and, yes, front organizations.
So you arrest the journalist covering the poverty that drives the insurgency?
No, you arrest the logistical node. But we should probably zoom out. You mentioned Project Exit the Gray List. You think this conviction is driven by a quota?
I don't think it. The numbers scream it. The Philippines is on the FATF gray list, the list of countries with dirty money problems. They are desperate to get off it. And so suddenly, terrorism financing cases just skyrocket. In 2023, there were 14 cases. In 2024, 66 cases. That is a 371% increase in 1 year.
Which is impressive enforcement.
It's suspicious. Did the police suddenly find 50 new masterminds? Or did they receive a memo, like the leaked CIGG memo, explicitly referencing Project Exit the Gray List, telling them to produce bodies? The Cernet 27, the Tacloban 5, these are development workers and church volunteers being rounded up just to pad the stats for the FATF auditors.
I have to push back on this quota narrative. A 371% increase doesn't automatically prove fabrication. It could prove prioritization. For years, the FATF criticized the Philippines for having laws on paper but never using them. They said, you have terrorists, but no terror finance convictions. That's impossible. So the state finally allocates resources, trains the police, enforces the law. Now that they are actually catching people, you call it a quota. The state is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't.
They are catching the wrong people. But let's pause on the why. Why is the state so desperate? Why ruin the lives of 27 development workers just to please a task force in Paris?
Because the economic stakes are massive. This isn't about pleasing Paris, it's about feeding families in Manila. When a country is on the gray list, international banks treat it like a leper. They de-risk, and that means they cut ties.
Which hurts who?
It hurts everyone. It hurts the overseas Filipino workers, the OFWs. There are millions of Filipinos sending money home. If the Philippines is on the gray list, the transaction fees for those remittances go up, the processing times get longer, in some cases the channels just close entirely. We are talking about billions of dollars that keep the Philippine economy afloat. So the government has a moral duty to get off that list to protect the livelihood of its citizens. If that requires a crackdown on the financial networks of the NPA, they view it as a necessary trade-off.
But that's the tragedy of it all. They're claiming to protect the economy by destroying the very civil society organizations that help the poor who rely on that economy. And the tool they're using, related accounts, is causing economic destruction on the ground.
Right, this is the asset freezing mechanism you mentioned earlier.
It's a blunt instrument used to bludgeon communities. Under the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act, the AMLC can freeze assets ex parte without telling you first. And they don't just freeze the accused, they freeze related accounts. Take the latest Center for Development, the LCDE.
The disaster relief NGO.
Right, award-winning, heavily involved in Typhoon Yolanda relief. The government red tax them. They freeze the NGO's accounts. Fine, argue that in court. But then they freeze the personal accounts of the executive director, then her family, and then, and this is where it just gets insane, they froze the accounts of a local hardware store and a grocery supplier.
Because they did business with the NGO.
Exactly! A hardware store owner sells plywood to an NGO to build shelters, and suddenly his business account is frozen. He can't pay his suppliers, he can't pay his staff. The business dies. This creates a massive chilling effect. Banks are now terrified. If you're an NGO in the Philippines, banks don't want your money because they are afraid the AMLC will freeze the bank's assets too. It is de-risking on steroids.
I will concede that the hardware store case sounds like an error in calibration. It's an edge case. However, you have to understand the logic of related accounts. Terrorist financing is fluid. It moves at the speed of a wire transfer. If the AMLC has to give notice or hold a hearing before freezing funds, well, the money's gone. It's in an offshore account in the Caymans before the judge even sits down.
So we suspend due process entirely?
We prioritize speed to stop the flow of funds. FATF Recommendation 6 requires targeted financial sanctions. The goal is to stop the money from buying the next bullet. If front organizations use a web of suppliers to launder money, the state has to be able to freeze that web. Yes, innocent businesses getting caught in the net is bad, very bad, and there should be a fast mechanism to unfreeze them. But you cannot dismantle the tool just because it is sharp.
It's not just sharp, it's being wielded by a surgeon who wants to kill the patient. And the patient here is civil society. The hardware store isn't an edge case. It's a feature of the system. It's designed to isolate the target. If you starve the NGO of suppliers, you shut it down without ever needing a trial. It is financial warfare against your own people. And look, this isn't just a Philippine problem. This is a global crisis. The Philippines is following a trend we see at the United Nations itself.
You mean regarding how states interact with the UN?
I mean how states use the terrorist label to legitimize reprisals against anyone who cooperates with the UN. We have reports from the International Service for Human Rights. Look at what happened to Hui Zhengqi.
The activist from Taiwan?
Yes, from the Garden of Hope Foundation. She wanted to attend a UN Women meeting, a session about domestic violence shelters. Not exactly controversial stuff. She was blocked. Why? Because of Chinese pressure regarding her passport and her status. But it goes darker. Look at Dolken Issa of the World Uyghur Congress.
China has designated him a terrorist.
Exactly. And because China, a powerful member state, slapped that terrorist label on him, they use it to try to bar him from UN forums. They intimidate other diplomats. They try to silence him in the very halls that are supposed to protect human rights. It connects directly back to Campio. The label terrorist is a magic wand. You wave it, and suddenly due process, free speech, and the right to a fair trial they disappear.
I come at this from a realist perspective regarding the UN. The UN is not a world government. It is a club of sovereign states. And if China or Nicaragua or the Philippines determines that a certain individual poses a security threat, the UN has very limited power to override that.
Even when that determination is clearly political, even when it prevents the UN from doing its job, the UN Committee on NGOs is notorious for this. It's supposed to grant civil society access. Instead, it acts as a gatekeeper for authoritarian regimes. States endlessly defer applications for NGOs they don't like. They block access to detained journalists. They deny access to communities.
But who decides it's political? That's the problem. UN Security Council Resolution 1373 mandates that all states prevent active or passive support for terrorism. It orders the Philippines to scrutinize NGOs. It orders China to stop separatist funding. So when these states act, they claim they are fulfilling their UN mandate. You call it a reprisal, they call it compliance. If the UN wants to change this, it needs to rewrite the resolutions, not blame the states for following them.
But compliance shouldn't mean criminalizing compassion. Go back to the Philippines for a second. We have cases of people charged with terror financing for sending 500 pesos, that's $9 to a political prisoner for food.
The Labiano and Tago case.
Yes, $9. If the global framework for counterterrorism cannot distinguish between buying a prisoner a meal and funding a bombing campaign, then the framework is broken. That is regulatory overreach. There's a distortion of FATF Recommendation 8, which is supposed to protect nonprofits, not treat them all as potential terror cells.
I agree that the 500 peso prosecution is an absurdity, that is, prosecutorial overreach. But we must distinguish that from the Cumpio verdict. The court found she provided ammunition. That is not a meal. That is lethal aid.
Found based on the testimony of a man who was likely threatened with jail if he didn't point the finger. And let's remember, the UN Special Rapporteur Irene Khan, she visited Frenchie in jail. She explicitly said the charges appeared to be in retaliation for her work. When the UN's own expert says this is a sham, we should listen.
Irene Khan is a respected voice, but she wasn't the trier of fact. She didn't sit through the cross-examination. Judge Perez did. And this brings me back to the hard truth about the security landscape, the Cumpio case. Tragic as the delay was, it sends a signal. The Philippines is signaling that it will no longer tolerate the gray zone, where legal organizations provide cover for illegal acts.
It signals that the Philippines will no longer tolerate independent reporting. Frenchie May was the anchor of Eastern Vista. She reported on military abuses in Tacloban. That is why she is in jail. The financing charge is just the convenient weapon they found in the FATF toolkit.
You say reporting, the court says logistics, and until the appeal is heard, that is the legal reality. The state is betting that by cutting off the money and the people who move it, the insurgency will starve. It is a harsh strategy. It produces casualties like the hardware store owner. But from the perspective of national security, it is a rational strategy.
Rational? It's self-destructive. When you silence the people who report on grievances, you don't end the insurgency, you fuel it. When you freeze the assets of aid groups, you create more desperate people who might turn to the insurgency. This strategy creates the very terrorists it claims to fight.
That is a theory. The conviction is a fact.
A fact built on a foundation of sand and coerced witnesses. We are witnessing the death of civil society by bureaucracy. Project Exit the Gray List has incentivized the fabrication of evidence. When a court can ignore an appellate ruling that money was clean and send a woman to prison for 18 years based on that same money, justice is dead. Frenchie May Cumpio is a symbol of a press under siege, and the international community, the FAF and the UN, are, I think, unwitting accomplices.
A harsh judgment, but one worth debating.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thank you for joining the debate. We encourage you to dig into the court records, read the Carpeton reports, and decide for yourself.
Until next time.